Okay, this is program number 596, broadcast number 596. It is May the 9th already, and it is 1983. I usually give about a 1-minute rundown of what happened this time last year. We were talking this time last year about the Antarctica war with Great Britain, the importance of Antarctica and Argentina, and that gets back to Alternative 3 that I was talking about earlier on the talk show. The book Antarctica, My Destiny by Captain Finn Ronne, R-O-N-N-E, and also the importance of Admiral Byrd and the secrets of Admiral Byrd's expeditions, and Lowell Thomas, who worked for the CIA, and Curtis LeMay, and the team that covered up what Admiral Byrd saw in his 1946 expedition. That would be the one right after the war, if, in fact, the top Nazis were able to escape to Argentina and Antarctica. I also was talking about John Hinckley and the trial that would be coming up, the rich boy covering up his American Gestapo, Posse Comitatus Nazi connections, that he would use his insanity plea, which he did and got off with. Dan White, the San Francisco policeman, used the Twinkie defense for killing the supervisor and the mayor in San Francisco. And now Mr. Miller's, the son of Ronald Reagan's attorney, is using the insanity plea. He's not going to have a trial yet because he raped and murdered his mother, because he wets his bed. That was the big problem. So you get Twinkies and you get Jodie Foster, and you get bedwetting, and the very rich seem to get out of their problems very nicely. I got a call this morning. There was an obituary in the paper. It was so small I didn't even see it. Chester Davis, you know who he is? Chester Davis, personal attorney to Howard Hughes for the last 16 years of the billionaire's life. He died in upstate New York. He was a native of Rome. I'll do a whole broadcast, or half of a broadcast, next week on him. He was part of the Mormon Mafia, working with the Rome Vatican Mafia. He was an Italian mafioso who came out. He was a chauffeur. He was a gopher for Hollywood, for the starlets, and for Terry Moore, and he ended up making 30, 40, 80 million. I lost track, but I have it at home, off the Hughes organization. He was one of the links of the Mormon Mafia. It was half mafiosa from Italy and half Mormon from Utah. The common denominators being David Kennedy in Utah, an elder of the church who worked with Michael Sindona, God's banker from Rome. He's in jail. They've both been charged with murder and taking money out of various banks in Italy and in the United States. The common denominator of Howard Hughes' captivity was the Mormon Church and the Vatican, and they took him and made an umbrella for the Nazification of the United States, and the U-2 flights, and the organized crime syndicate took over the Hughes organization, took his body to Boston. It was never seen again, moved into Vegas, bought up various hotels. Chester Davis is very much part of Americana history, just as Charles Bluedorn was when I did the programs on Gulf and Western. He was on page 19, a 2-inch obituary. He died Thursday, almost unnoticed. So we'll a little more on Chester Davis next week. Also, a top executive choked at the Capitol in D.C., the top executive of Grace Company, from Vice President of W.R. Grace, Senior Vice President Richard L. Bowditch, B-O-W-D-I-T-C-H, choked in Washington. I just got that from a World Watcher in New York City today, and we'll do more on that later. This last week, I talked about the chain of connection to the Bulgarian assassination attempt on the Pope being broken. The London Times says that's falling apart. There is no link. And then the next day on NBC News, Tom Brokaw gave a big smile and said, I'll give you Marvin Kalb. And Marvin Kalb had a program, or what do they do on NBC News, a 2-minute little blurb. Marvin Kalb reported tonight that the top officials of the CIA are leaning away from the theory that there was a Bulgarian connection. The CIA never had that theory, and Mr. Casey never went for it at all. He's kept silent through this whole thing. This has been NBC and Marvin Kalb and Michael Ledeen and the propagandist Claire Sterling, that shtick that it was a Bulgarian or a KGB that shot at the Pope. Marvin Kalb was on the air saying CIA Director William Casey is leaning from that theory. CIA Director William Casey has changed his mind and believes there may not be a Bulgarian connection in the papal assassination plot. Finally, They give a shooting attempt the word plot. We'd never get that in the United States. Then Kalb went on, this has been confirmed by a key CIA official. As key CIA source, it represents a victory of sorts for Casey's deputies. They have been very skeptical of this connection. And when this approach came to light, the State Department officials demanded and got an investigation. It was conducted by the CIA, which cleared its agents. Now, that's a funny way to say it. I played the tape back and typed it up. The agent that worked from the CIA with Agent right at the Vatican Square and up through the whole thing was Frank Turple. And it slipped in, and as I say, I played it back and typed it. The investigation cleared its agents. Did you know the CIA was even considered as part of the plot to shoot the Pope? Well, anyway, the Marvin Kalb was saying that Sergei Antonov may be released, that they're planning to release him. And then he backtracked and said that Ronald Reagan has confirmed that he'll go with whatever investigation is going. I doubt if he will, but if it turns out that Agent did, in fact, get his gun from the Gehlen Nazi operation, which he did, it will get faded away in the news. You remember how the Tylenol story faded away? The Tylenol suspect, he had an operation for throat cancer about a month ago, Mr. Lewis. You haven't heard a word about him. Another story I want to update before most of the program is going to be on the Hitler diaries. W.R. Grace and Company acquires a DeLorean subsidiary. Isn't that great? Grace acquired Composite Technology Corporation, a subsidiary of DeLorean Motor Company. I believed all along that John DeLorean was linked with J. Peter Grace and Opus Dei and the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and that he had a very high role in espionage, and the cocaine connections were just a minor part of the whole story. So it's interesting that Mr. Grace, with his strong Vatican Nazi links, is now buying one of DeLorean's companies. It was sold to Grace's Emerson and Cummings subsidiary. Now, what they may have bought was the list of people that they did business with. That may be as important as anything else in the whole story, is to combine the names and call it a business. It could be just a front of a sort. It's called Composite Technology Corporation, a plastic subsidiary of DeLorean Motor. Also, I have to just briefly mention, do more later, Patty Hearst kidnapper Bill Harris paroled, 1974. I wrote the SLA is the CIA. It is, it was, and it always will be. Now, Mr. Harris got out of jail and went to the attorney who represented Russell Little when he shot and killed the school superintendent up in Oakland. He went up to that law office, and he's going to be a paralegal or maybe go on to Indiana, where he can work for the Spiro Agnew YAF group that he came from originally as a narc in Indiana. They had nerve to say, Mr. Hanlon, the attorney, said, he's not involved in politics. He doesn't want to be involved in politics. He doesn't want to be a spokesman. A spokesman for what? For putting a student in a closet, for raping her, to have men line up and screw her, in a closet, drug her, and kidnap her to cross state lines to make her sit and watch the television where their 6 friends are cremated on the dinner hour. And then they go to the Carmichael Bank. Patty has a getaway car, and Mrs. Harris, Emily Harris, they shoot and kill a woman, a mother of 4 children, up at the Carmichael Bank. What they have in common with the Hearst is that the Hearst family paid off this particular family so that they wouldn't be charged with murder. So they're out easy. What kind of politics? They have the nerve on the news to say he doesn't want to talk at campuses. What? Compare yourself to G. Gordon Liddy even, or Timothy Leary. These cruddy people who were in counterintelligence, narcs, brutally cold people, what are they going to talk about in politics? Now, this is really mean. I have to put something mean in this evening. I'm usually very nice. I was reading The Last Days of the Late Great State of California by Kurt Gentry. It came out in 1968. And I was looking up the references to Ronald Reagan's early career because he had him down pat and blamed him for half of what was happening in this state. But in the book, he says, when Reagan was running for governor, he went to speak at Coalinga Junior College. That's the place where they had the earthquake that decimated the town, and the whole town's down in rubble. Okay, Coalinga Junior College, when Reagan was campaigning, he was questioned about the Far Eastern situation, and Reagan advocated declaring war on North Vietnam. We could pave the whole country and put parking strips on it and still be home for Christmas. Declaring war would have another benefit. It would end the peace marches. It's kind of ironic. I bet all the people at Coalinga voted for Reagan, but maybe the karma came back, and now Coalinga is a parking lot instead of North Vietnam. That's very nasty of me, but I thought it was kind of funny that he chose that place to make his famous speech, considering what happened in Coalinga. It isn't funny at all, but it caught my attention. Okay, a missing ex-General Motor aide found slain in New York State Lake, Mr. George M. Perry. I got a letter from a world watcher that sent me this New York Times article, and he said, May, before I listened to you, this wouldn't have meant much to me. Thanks for your help in understanding the news. It's a story about a man, George Perry, who's worked for General Motors 30 years. That's all during the John DeLorean time. He was found, he was murdered in first of the year, January of 83. His body was found in a park in New York with 322 caliber bullets. Now, it's interesting that some people are getting a little smarter than they used to be. The New York Times says that George M. Perry may have worked for the United States intelligence, for the United States, and they're looking into details and his record in World War II. Is it possible that journalists are actually going back to the connections of World War II, which is very essential, that I keep harping on week after week and trying to illustrate the linear connection of these people working in espionage with top Nazis, with the CIA. The OSS became the CIA, and setting up what became the Odessa, the Nazi network, in hopes to take over the whole world again. Mr. Perry spent most of his time out of the country, 30 years with General Motors. He was in Scotland, European continent, and South America. He was about to move in Brazil. He was on his way to Zurich, Switzerland. He served in Argentina and Bolivia. That's the Klaus Barbie country. In 1972, he was named managing director of General Motors in Argentina. General Motors and the Ford Motor Company were, and ITT were the three notorious funders of Adolf Hitler, of double dealing and selling during the war, after the war, espionage covers, and so forth. So this fellow at the time in January, when John DeLorean is arrested, when Roberta Calvi's been hung a few months earlier, when Licio Gelli of the Vatican from Argentina, where this man lived, he's in jail as of September. That's right, the same day before Grace Kelly was killed. The network of agents is closing in, and there seems to be a lot of murders of people that have touched all these bases. So this is an interesting kind of obituary. They found his body just last week, and I'm sure we'll hear more about George Perry, or maybe we won't. But a lot of these interesting characters, I call them the millionaires, are being often. In fact, I did one or two programs on just the necessity of killing particular millionaires, heads of corporations that have a part in the direct espionage activity of our government. And because certain people have been arrested, like Mr. Michael Sindona in a New York jail, Edwin Wilson is in jail, Licio Gelli is in a Swiss jail. There's a lot of people, if they aren't killed, like Roberta Calvi or the witnesses I mentioned last week, they're sitting in jail, and goodness knows how much is going to come out. And Klaus Barbie's been brought back from Bolivia, a home base of this guy. So his pals, I guess, from Bolivia and Argentina are on the run, and he's found with 322 bullets in the head. Now, I mentioned that each week I'm going to do a section on the John Kennedy assassination. In fact, everything that I do on this program and have done for the past 12 years has to do with the people who killed John Kennedy, but did a lot of other murders too, death squads, but they had a role in the Kennedy murder. And I want to specifically do a lot on John Kennedy every week and tie it together because it's the 20th anniversary of his death. And I will get back to the YAF, the Young Americans for Freedom. I did 2 broadcasts on that, and I'll do more. But the Hitler Diary saga is so important that I'm going to do some other stories with you and get back to that. But I want to share one chapter of a book called Kissinger, The Portrait of a Mind. This is a book by Stephen Graubard, Graubard, published by Norton, W.W. Norton and Company in 1973. And this is quite a detailed account of the life of Henry Kissinger. I got it from the library, so if any of you can find it at a used bookstore, I'll put you on the look for it. I have to own this one. And it tells about his career and with Mr. Fritz Kramer in the Army and how he goes to Harvard and he's a student. and how he's brought to New York City to be with the Council of Foreign Relations and with Nelson Rockefeller. And it has what he was doing during the Eisenhower years and then what he was doing during the Kennedy-Johnson years. It carries his career through. Okay. Now, he worked with McGeorge Bundy when John Kennedy became president. And the powers that be intended Richard Nixon to be president, but Kennedy won the election. So there's a little interim before Nixon could be their president, but they were all sitting and waiting on the sides. McGeorge Bundy came from Harvard, and a lot of the staff and the cabinet that John Kennedy selected were from Harvard. And McGeorge Bundy had been at Harvard. He was at Groton and Yale. He had a fellow at Harvard, and he was in charge of the defense for John Kennedy. And Kennedy gave him a very important role in our Defense Department. Now, in this book, it says Bundy was a central figure at Harvard at a time when Kissinger was scarcely known. But Kissinger was tapped long before Bundy even dreamt about it, probably. Both Bundy and Schlesinger were appointed by John Kennedy to be in the White House, along with many of his other friends. But Kissinger, this little sneaky rat, Kissinger enjoyed unofficial access to the kind of information that had not been so readily available during the Eisenhower years. When Eisenhower was president, Richard Nixon was vice president, Kissinger wasn't getting all that he wanted, but through the Harvard people, he begins to get it. And it says that Bundy invited Henry Kissinger, when John Kennedy was president, to become a part-time consultant to the National Security Council. He already was important in overthrowing Mossadegh and putting the Shah of Iran and being part of the CIA and the Harvard faculty. But when Kennedy was president, he was invited unofficially to be a consultant to the National Security Council to advise on German policy. And remember, his mentor, this Fritz Kramer from Germany, is sitting in the Pentagon, and his protege Kissinger has got his foot now as a German policy advisor in the behind doors. It says Kissinger would continue to teach at Harvard. You thought he was just a teacher there. But in fact, he gained access to papers that he would not otherwise have, and a massive safe was installed by our government in his Divinity Avenue address as the only external evidence of his new role. The Defense Department, the National Security Agency, stuck stuff in his safe up there in Boston. In the summer of 1961, before and after the building of the Berlin Wall, he went steadily to Washington. He commuted back and forth between Harvard and Washington. He wasn't in a position to impose his ideas on the White House yet, because in Washington, Bundy was the boss, and Kissinger made the grave mistake of thinking that he could advise them at the National Security Council. And this book says that he never fully appreciated the difficulty of working as a subordinate. He was ready to take over, and he had to be a subordinate for a while. And it said the people there that had come to Washington with Kennedy had pulled up their stakes and gone to Washington in quotes for the duration. The author put for the duration. So Kissinger could only be a part-time consultant. Now, for the duration had to mean until John Kennedy's head was blown off. And 2 days later, Fritz Kramer in the Pentagon and Alexander Haig and the whole war machine escalated the war, read the Pentagon papers, and see the control that they had in getting the war in Vietnam going. But they had little slippery Kissinger there all of the time. Now, prior to that, in the same book, it tells about how the Rockefeller brothers set up a special studies project at Harvard. Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a special studies project at Harvard prior to when Kennedy came in, 1956 to 58, and it was for Henry Kissinger, and some of the members of his group are listed in the book, and I'm just going to give you a few of them. Adolph Burl Jr. Adolph Burl was the man who worked with Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss, prosecuting Alger Hiss, getting Richard Nixon's career going, and making the Cold War, the Red Scare. Adolph Burl Jr.'s name is through all the books on the Alger Hiss case. He was from Columbia University and at one time ambassador to Brazil. Another person in the special studies group was General Lucius Clay. He worked with Nazi Fritz Kramer, with Henry Kissinger, with a group at Omer Ammergau after the war, the World War II Nazis. He was sorry that Hitler lost the war. And Mr. Patton and General Lucius Clay were two military monsters that were so pro-German, and he's put into the study group set up by the Rockefellers with Henry Kissinger. Another was Henry Luce. the man who in life and time, had the speeches of Hitler, Mussolini, pro-Nazi, and of course, Mr. Whittaker Chambers worked for Henry Luce before he began getting Alger Hiss discredited and removed from public office, and Alger Hiss went to jail. Luce had hired him and many other people that you know, and has been a source of defending fascism and propaganda. Another in the class in this discussion group was David Sarnoff of NBC. Now, that's very interesting because as soon as Kennedy is dead and as soon as Nixon is in, the man to sit by Henry Kissinger's side and travel with him for every speech, every trip is either Bernard Kalb or particularly Marvin Kalb. And I've mentioned them in connection with Henry Kissinger and the scandal of Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger. So Mr. David Sarnoff, NBC, the man responsible for Marvin and Bernard Kalb, turning Kissinger over to them for the media coverage that he gets. Even today he was on TV bringing in a soccer team. He has to get his name in the news all the time because they're going to try and push him for president of the United States. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, who was at Los Alamos and later at Lawrence Livermore Lab in Stanford. I don't have to tell you about Teller. He was part of that discussion group. And Oveta Kulb, C-U-L-B, Hobby, from the Houston CIA foundations, where the black money, the death money coming out of Houston, Texas for the assassinations. And Leon Jaworski belonged to a CIA foundation in Houston, Texas. Houston was represented in that group. And interestingly enough, Justin Dart. Now, that is a link to the future of Ronald Reagan in the kitchen cabinet. He's one of the men that was pushing Ronald Reagan from very early time. He was part of the group at Harvard, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. So Kennedy was followed. They knew everything he was doing. They escalated the war when he was over. And that is Kissinger going back and forth with a trunk of goodies in his office in Boston. Goodness knows what the Pentagon was giving him when they were getting ready to blow off John Kennedy's head. Now, the rest of the program for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about the Hitler Diary Part 2. I discussed it with you last week. Sometimes when I leave this station, I feel that I have really covered a lot of material, and I'm taking you to another place that you can understand and follow. And sometimes, like last week, when I went home, I had given certain names on the air, like Gert Heidemann, Heidemann, and SS Karl Wolff, and SS Brigadefuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, Mohnke. And I said, it doesn't matter who wrote the diaries. Let's zoom in on the people that are involved, because the people is the story, not the ink, the paper, and so forth. And as it turned out, this is what is happening. The people are the story. And when I left last week and I talked about the pilots, the Lufthansa airline, I wondered, are people really understanding what I'm saying about the diary? Do they understand the importance of whatever it is that surfaced now? It is the people that surface now. More we'll find out about the paper and the ink and the bindings later. But who are these dogs that worked with Mr. Gert Heidemann that were the excuse for the diary? It was the people. So I want to discuss some of those people in detail with you tonight. So I gave you their names last week and continue from what I did. And if you didn't have that broadcast, you can get the tape cassettes. It's taped off the air, and you can get that broadcast part 1 or part 2 of the Hitler Diary. Now, there was an article in the London Observer, The Tragic History of Double Dac. The R-E is silent, D-A-C-R-E. I call him Count Dracula. You can call him anything you want, or you can call him Hugh Trevor Roper, because that was his name before he was knighted by the Queen. The London Observer has a story, and it really did my heart good, because I have a lot of patience. And 5 years ago, on broadcast number 339, that was in July 1978, I was talking about Hugh Trevor Roper and Mark Lane, two of those horrors of history who have not told the truth, have not told the whole truth, who have been so deceptive and have been in the attention of the media, and their lies have not been exposed for what they were. And finally, an article in the London Observer, it says, I'll quote the author, his name is Connor Cruz O'Brien. The Tragic History of Double Dack. Okay, I'll give you just a few sentences of what he says. I'm not all that worried about whether the Hitler diaries are genuine, and that's what I tried to tell you. He said, I'm getting a bit worried about whether Lord Dack is genuine. Who was this individual who did so much to say the diaries were authentic? I suggest that the real Lord Dack, you, Trevor Roper, a squab and sinister man, a master of deceit, betrayed the confidence of the free world. His reputation as a historian stands particularly high among the non-historians who make up the bulk of the population. Now, this is the man that was sent in by Winston Churchill to tell the world how Hitler died without ever getting any of the facts that were not clear at all. And he was legion. He's always been quoted about that story. Now, I am sure if he tried to pull that in 1983 after Watergate and the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Committee and all the exposés, it wouldn't wash in Peoria or anywhere else. And the London Observer says this is a serious matter when an individual answering to the name as a pillar of society steps forward to authenticate what is possibly an artifact. What evidence do I have for my hypothesis that Lord Dack, for whom we've been hearing so much lately, must really be another fellow altogether? I'll call him Double Dack, the London Observer said. I have a lot more evidence for that than Dack or Double Dack has for any authenticity of those diaries. And this man goes on to say, I'm satisfied that they're not authentic, but he asked the question, how did he put himself in that position? And then he said, it is too late to turn back what he said. And you, Trevor Roper, said, I put my career, my reputation on the line. He said, it is too late to turn back what he said. The statement remains on the record. He vouched for these 60 volumes without even seeing more than 2. He had unlimited time. In a few hours, he called London. London Times hires him, and he tells them, yes, you can go ahead with him. He said the deficiencies are in his reasoning and his evidence, and they cannot be removed. That is not the way historians are supposed to act. In defending himself, Lord Dack said he was working under certain constraints. Getting back to the Warren Report, to John J. McCloy on the commission, Gerald Ford, who's living and traveling around very prosperous, and John McCone was CIA director of this whole charade when Kennedy was murdered. He lives right here on Monterey Peninsula. These people did not tell the story about what happened, and Lord Dack is excusing himself. I worked under certain constraints. And this London Observer is saying, what constraints was he under? This is exactly what John McCloy and Alan Dulles and Gerald Ford and the entire staff of the Warren Commission, hundreds of lawyers and witnesses, were manipulated. And he says the diaries appear to be garbage, but Lord Dack thinks the sheer quality of the garbage is evidence of its authenticity. And getting back to the John Kennedy assassination, they thought if they put 26 volumes out and sold them around, made them very expensive, and sold them at the sheer volumes that nobody would go through them. In fact, Alan Dulles said it at one of the meetings, print it because no one will read it. Well, it took a long time for somebody publicly to call attention to this man because, as I say, on broadcast number 339, this was in July 1978, I mentioned that you, Trevor Roper, wrote the introduction to Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment. It wasn't a bad book, but Mark Lane, in all these years, in 20 years, has left out the Nazi connections of Nazi criminal Walter Dornberger, the Permindex operation coming out of Rome with John Connolly and Albert Osborne, the Argentine connections to the Nazis to Alexander Zeiger, the Division 5 of the FBI, the use of the NASA space scientists, the intelligence system. Mark Lane, for 20 years, has diverted away from the people who killed John Kennedy and has stayed on the grassy knoll. He should have by now been able to count every blade of grass. Now, I mentioned Sylvia Meagher a couple of weeks ago, leaving out the names of the Munich people that came to kill John Kennedy. Why, on the anniversary of Kennedy's death 20 years later, am I turning you on to some of the lies of history? Well, I really owe it to you because you have to be able to know the difference between what is told and what is left out and why it's taken 20 years to get the story. Now, another story from the same London Observer, while they're writing about Lord Dack, was an outrageous statement, and I want to share that with you. Maybe we should take a break before we get into the London Observer story to show you how the news is manipulated, the major stories of writers, depending on who is selected to do the story. They divert you away from the facts and try to make your mind be so far off that you'll remember the details of the mistakes and not read further to check out the facts for yourself. We'll take a 1-minute break. This is KAZU FM. Now, this is side 2 of broadcast number 596. It's May the 9th, 1983. I really can't get used to those dates. It goes so fast. Now, getting back to the remark that was in the London Observer, May the 1st, 1983. They were describing Gert Heidemann, the man who was supposed to have located the diaries. They said Heidemann was a high-powered researcher rather than a writer. Incidentally, he has traveled all over the world. He's worked 30 years with Stern magazine, so he knew what he was doing. And he isn't fired, and he isn't going to leave. And he covered every revolution in Asia and South America. This is a pretty wise cookie. It says Heidemann was a high-powered researcher, and he received information of Hitler's old guard. That's after he bought Göring-Jott, SS Brigadier Fuhrer, Brigadefuhrer, Wilhelm Mohnke. I had him on the broadcast last week, Mohnke, was the bunker's last commander, and he told Heidemann about some important papers belonging to the Fuhrer. And I mentioned that this whole thing had more to do with blackmail than it had to do with who wrote the diaries, that there is a big story here, and they're beginning to acknowledge that in the papers if you read them just today. Now, the London Observer says neither SS Wolf, who went to Göring-Jott to be with Heidemann, neither SS Wolf nor Mohnke were hardline Nazis, but in 1920 they were part of the Freikorps, F-R-E-I-K-O-R-P-S officers, who, like many other nationalists, joined the Nazi bandwagon. Yippee! After World War II, Wolf was sentenced to 10 years in prison for military irregularities and partly commuted, and Mohnke was not even sentenced. Now, that is a description of two men that I mentioned last week on the air, my cast of characters. They were just guys that joined the bandwagon, okay, and they're not important. And Wolf had some military irregularities. Well, who were these characters? I mean, why does the London Observer throw this out? And I've seen this over and over again, this kind of crap. I just reached one book, The Damned Engineers. I have many books on the subject. The Damned Engineers is about the Battle of the Bulge. My friend Fritz Kramer and that gang, you know, the ones I've been studying and sharing with you on the broadcast all along, those particular characters. Okay. It says Hitler rested his highest hopes at the end of the war on the 6th Panzer Army. That was Mr. Fritz Kramer, and Mr. Dietrich had his hopes on the ISS Panzer Corps. It was beefed up. It was the strongest corps, and these were Hitler's top people that were going to meet the American Army and socialize over there with the Battle of the Bulge in this particular area where they would be close during the war and after the war. And next week I'll do some more on their close contacts with each other. Now, in describing this SS, the ISS Panzer Corps, this book describes this was the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, the Liebestandarte. Maybe you know that name, Liebestandarte, the Liebestandarte Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS General Wilhelm Mohnke. This was the elite Panther Corps. Because this story of the Bulge is largely concerned with this Liebestandarte division, Janice Holt-Giles writes in her book, something must be known about it. It is helpful to understand its savagery and know something about its background. In the beginning, they were organized, the SF, by Hitler as a small elite group of 280 men sworn to absolute obedience and loyalty to him personally. They were his bodyguards, and Himmler took over this nucleus and made the Black Shirts the most dreaded men on the face of Europe, known as the SS. They composed various military branches, and varying duties and characteristics, but the Waffen SS was strictly military, but the Leibstandarte Division had its proud origins in the original bodyguard unit, its crack armored regiment, the 1st SS Panzer. It was the Death's Head unit. I've talked about the Death Head on this program. The Death Head began as concentration camp guards in 1940. They took the youngest and best men, winded them out, put them in the military unit. The 1st Panzer Regiment was not only Leibstandarte, but Totenkopf, Totenkopf. Their insignia was a Death Head. And General Mohnke was meeting. He worked in the Battle of the Bulge with Lieutenant Colonel Piper, with Mr. Otto Skorzeny, with Fritz Kramer, with Mr. Dietrich. In this book, it tells how they worked together with, it mentions Fritz Kramer, the head of the 6th Panzer Division, Otto Skorzeny. Now, these people, Skorzeny was to set up the Odessa after the war. This was the most dangerous, the most trusted man that Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler had, who was meeting with Mr. Gert Heidemann. And the London Observer says that these were just innocent little bystanders who joined the army as a fluke. Now, who was SS Karl Wolff, the second party close to Mr. Gert Heidemann? And later we're going to take our travels. They're going to be with Mrs. Martin Bormann in Italy. They know where the Nazi art treasures are. They're going to be with Klaus Barbie. And I mentioned last week they were down with Walter Rauff in Chile. And then this week in the news that came out, I said there's no way that they could go down to Chile and not see their Nazi worker Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, Alexander Haig had ordered the murder of Allende so Mr. Pinochet could be in power in Chile, and Walter Rauff from Nazi Germany taught them how to slice people up at Colonial Dignidad, how to torture, how to round up. If you see the movie Missing, it's a picnic compared to what Walter Rauff really was capable of doing, but you get a pretty good idea. Now, in the Brown book, a very rare book on Nazis living in Germany after the war, it was sent to me by a world watcher in New York City. There's a section on Mr. Karl Wolff, the man that the London paper says he was charged for military irregularities. Karl Wolff was Himmler's adjutant. He was arrested in his villa in Italy. For 17 years, he worked with Allen Dulles, with NATO, with the top military people. And when Mr. Eichmann was brought to trial in Israel in 1962, Mr. Wolff's name came up, so he was put in prison. He was the general of the Waffen SS, the armed SS. He was the chief of the personal staff of the Reich Fuhrer. He was the liaison of Himmler to Adolf Hitler. He had special powers. He was the leader of the final solution of the Jewish question. He bore responsibility for the murder of at least 300,000 Polish Jews at Treblinka. He was the highest SS and police chief in Italy, and he worked in Rome, Italy with the Vatican, and then they were instrumental in getting Martin Bormann and their top Nazis passports out to go to South America. He was in Italy, and his friend Walter Rauff was in Milan working with the Milan Mafia and the Secretary of the Vatican, Pope Paul VI. He went on to be Pope Paul VI, Mr. Montini. He was the highest SS police chief in Italy. He committed numerous crimes from September 43 in Italy. He had 15,000 Italian men, women, and children murdered. He was guilty of carrying out the experiments on prisoners at Dachau concentration camps. That was one of his jobs. He lived with his real name in West Germany. The West German press knew where he was. They pointed to him. He was active there. He was only arrested in 1962 when his name came up in the trials in Israel, and they slapped him in jail and let him out. Mr. Lemitzer of the United States Army and Allen Dulles and all the military and CIA were instrumental in pleading, let this nice man out. And he was charged with 300,000 deaths of Jews, 15,000 Italians, medical experiments at Dachau concentration camp. And the London Observer passes them off. Now, when Mr. Gert Heidemann got married, attending his wedding, the best men at the wedding, he had to have two, not one. One was SS Karl Wolff, and one was Wilhelm Mohnke. One of the things he was prosecuted for was correspondence where he said, he wrote in 1942 a letter that he had special joy that 5,000 members of the chosen people are going to Treblinka every day. This is from the book Operation Sunrise. And if you want information about SS Karl Wolfe, get The Secret Surrender by Alan Dulles, or Operation Sunrise. And I'll do more on the air with you next week, the role he had with William Donovan, with Himmler, with Hitler's people in Italy, making, wheeling, and dealing so that when the war was over, the smooth transition of the American army coming in and then Wolfe surviving. And as I say, by a fluke, he went to jail, but he was quickly out. Well, now, Mr. Monkey was in this top special death's head group, was in that close geographic area with where Henry Kissinger was at the Battle of the Bulge, and Prince Bernhard and Mr. Piper and Dietrich and these various people that Joe McCarthy had released, and John J. McCloy made a point of releasing from prison, Dachau prison. That's why I call the story of John Kennedy's murder from Dachau to Dallas. They were all taken as prisoners. They were all released. And they all linked down to South America and the international Nazi movement that have been doing death squads for so long. Now, Mr. Monkey not only is written up in every book on the Battle of the Bulge, you'll find his name, but he has another position. His buddies all go to the docket. I don't know how he separates from them, but what happens is that he is in charge of the bunker. He's been Hitler's right-hand man. He's entered every country with Hitler that Hitler invaded. He is at his side. This is the guy that Gerd Heidemann is with and socializing with as soon as they have Goring's yacht, and I'm sure long before that, but the yacht was the excuse. And the excuse of traveling with SS Karl Wolfe down to Mengeles and Bormann and Walter Ralph and Klaus Barbie in South America was he was going to write a book on SS Wolfe. He was just the traveling Odessa network. That's what he was, and that's why the diary story is so big. But if you have any books on the last days of Hitler, and particularly the book called The Bunker by James P. O'Donnell, it was published by Houghton Mifflin in 1978, read The Bunker. I read the book this weekend. I just sat down and read the whole book because when you get the index, there are many, many pages, 40 or 50 pages in the index about Wilhelm Mohnke, Mohnke. But Mr. O'Donnell doesn't tell you that he's the order of the death's head, that he's the head of the death's head, that he was set up very, very early with Heinrich Himmler, that Himmler's two men, Himmler, as I say, the most feared man in the world next to Otto Skorzeny, had SS Karl Wolfe in Italy making arrangements. And then he had Mr. Monkey in the eastern part of Europe with Der Fuhrer in Berlin. So his buddies are taken prisoner at some point, and I haven't yet been able to find the date that they were taken, but he is in charge of the bunker. So when you're reading the book on the bunker, you see this same character, Wilhelm Mohnke. When you read about the Bulge, you see it, but they don't make the connections in either book. The Bulge book is about the Battle of the Bulge, and the bunker doesn't tell his activities with Hitler's Martin Bormann and Otto Skorzeny. See, the important thing is that I said the reason for the Battle of the Bulge being so important is that the war would have been over 7 months earlier, and Montgomery could have gone through Europe and into Berlin, but the battle was stalled by General Eisenhower so that Mr. Patton can get in, and it was stalled 7 months so that Martin Bormann could get the jewels and the money and the forged money. And this Mr. Monkey also works with the top forgers of Nazi Germany. We'll do more on that next week. But the purpose of stalling it, of letting the Americans die, of holding the line, of Skorzeny impersonating Americans, is to stall the war, to get to Berlin, even if the Russians were moving from the other direction till all the cash is out of Europe. That was Operation Bernhard. And Prince Bernhard was instrumental in the betrayal of the army at Arnhem, and it was called Operation Bernhard. So interestingly enough, this was Martin Bormann's scheme. So in the bunker, the last days of Hitler is, again, Heinrich Himmler, Mr. Wolfe's boss, Mr. Monkey's boss, with Martin Bormann. They left on the 20th of April, and Mr. Monkey's in charge. Now, this book, if you read it carefully, you read those last days of Hitler, and you go through that whole book called The Bunker, you get the library paperback, there is no way that you can say without any doubt in your mind that that was Hitler dead. This book leaves a lot of unanswered questions. And, of course, again, it was you, Trevor Roper, who's working with Gert Heidemann and Mr. Mohnke and SS Wolfe, who tells you the Fuhrer died. Now, in this book, it tells that Mr. Wilhelm Mohnke revealed that Hitler had a double in the bunker. That's on page 366. And they tell how they had to kill off the double, and they displayed him publicly. Well, how many other doubles were there? And it tells how he worked so closely with the Fuhrer up to the very last hour. The Fuhrer says, tell me when the Russians are within 24 hours so I can go. And his pilots are in and out, and Bormann's cleaning out the secret papers. And Mr. Monkey is so important to the Fuhrer and the important Bormann papers that could blackmail the Western world. I think this whole story has more to do with blackmail. I said that 3 weeks ago. I used to play bridge a lot before I became a researcher and put more time in bridge and research, and I know what a trump card is. And these dogs hold a lot of trump cards. That's why before this program began, when we were talking on the talk show, we were talking about 60 Minutes and Rudolf Hess, and I'll do more next week on it. These people have a lot of information and diaries. Those diaries may have been written after 1964, but that doesn't mean a thing. We haven't seen what's in the 60 volumes. So Monkey was working at the Battle of the Bulge with Fritz Kramer, with Sepp Dietrich, Otto Skorzeny, Mr. Piper, and Mr. Herman Priest. Then he skips out. All of them are in the docket at Dachau. He skips out, and he's there with the Fuhrer, with the doubles, with Hannah Reich, R-E-I-T-S-C-H, the pilot, Hitler's favorite pilot, and with General Robert Ritter, another pilot of his. And the book, The Bunker, tells you when Himmler left, when Hannah Rausch allegedly left with Bormann. Now, they're all leaving, and this book also tells you that Bormann died, and he didn't die, and Mr. Mueller was supposed to die, and he didn't die, and Rudolf Hess is in that prison. It will be cremated, and nobody can talk to him. So in this book, it also says that Marshal Zhukov said there's no solid evidence that Hitler died, and then Churchill wondered, and they sent in Hugh Trevor Roper, that double Dacker, the great guy who is now caught with his lies of convenience. And it also brings up the subject of 40 survivors. Where are they now, and where are the papers? So among this team, this very important Mr. MOHNKE was working with my favorite character, the German Nazi Fritz Kramer. Incidentally, I finally had the nerve to send to Washington a letter to Fritz Kramer. I mailed it out today. If I'm killed this week, you'll know why. I didn't do it because I wanted to die. It took a lot of nerve to do it. I sent a picture of Fritz Kramer from the book, The Battle of the Bulge, and I just sent it to his Washington office and said, is this your picture? Mr. Fritz Kramer, I gave you the address on there. Is this your picture? Because I really want to know if Hitler's Fritz Kramer has been running our Pentagon all these years. It took a lot of nerve. I guess that took more nerve than anything I've done since I have been doing my research. I said, is this you? And if it isn't you, where did Hitler's Fritz Kramer go after the war? I just asked him 2 questions. I kept a copy of the letter. Let's see what happens. Now, there was a story in this, it was a wire service AP story in the San Francisco Chronicle today. German editor says an ugly story feared behind the Hitler hoax. There may be an ugly story. As soon as the diaries came, the historian said, we'll have to rewrite history. This may change everything. If they were so sure of their history, why did they have to rewrite anything? Now, just in summary, because I've given you a lot of material about these names, I want to explain some of these cast of characters again, because their names come up in every event. Isn't it funny that when a story of Hitler's diary comes, we have the head of the Death's Head over there in the Battle of the Bulge with all my favorite people that I've been talking about. The main characters involved in the United States and in the betrayal of the United States, in wheeling and dealing, in supporting Adolf Hitler, building him up. Forget Great Britain. I'm talking about the United States. Before the war, during the war, and after the war, and worked with SS Karl Wolf and Joseph Mengele, who worked with NASA and does experiments down in Paraguay, and Klaus Barbie and Otto Skorzeny, all working with the CIA. There were certain main characters, I can't list them all, but there's certain names that run through this whole thing, and they also run through the murder of John Kennedy when we get back to that. John J. McCloy, who was the attorney's, his office represented I.G. Farr, but the 10 years he lived in Paris from 1930 to 40. When he was at the Olympic Games with Adolf Hitler, he was with Rudolf Hess just prior to his flying to Great Britain, and maybe that, the Rockefeller connections, the Farben connections, that's one of the reasons the United States and Great Britain together don't want this person, whoever it is, to be seen or known. John J. McClure was on the Warren Commission, an important person. It was Sullivan, the laws of Sullivan and Cromwell, Allen Dulles. John Foster Dulles, his brother, became the Secretary of State. Allen Dulles sat in Bern, Switzerland with Mr. Walter Rauff and SS Karl Wolff, who was simultaneously doing the experiments at Treblinka and murdering these people, sending masses of them off daily to their deaths with his personal joys. And he's sitting with our lawyers and representatives in Switzerland simultaneously giving orders at the same time he's sitting with the United States government, and then sitting, of course, in Germany at the coffee houses with Mengele. Mengele wasn't even wanted after all his experiments at the death camps for a few years until he was recognized and then went on south. William Donovan of the OSS. And then, of course, this marvelous book on the Belarusian secret, the Nazis coming to this country. The key men during that period were Richard Nixon, Frank Wisner, and Nelson Rockefeller. Now, I believe that Eisenhower's reward for stalling the war and letting these Nazis out and this network continue, because we're going to have Russia as our enemy, was to make Eisenhower president of the United States and Richard Nixon his vice president. I believe now that anyone that ran against Nixon in 1960 would have been killed. I don't think anything John Kennedy did even alone was the cause of his death. If Adlai Stevenson had won the nomination, he would have been killed. Nixon was selected long time ago in 1946, or when he was in the Navy intelligence. Herman Abst is an important man because of his running the Reichsbank, taking care of the Deutsche Bank, rather the money that paid Hitler and the salaries of the Goerings and the Wolves and the whole gang. He wrote their paychecks. He was on the board of IG Farben. He wrote the paycheck for John Paul, who was just Mr. Karl Wojtyla, working at Solvay Chemical at Auschwitz, and now is in charge of the Vatican Bank. Herman Abst is important. And then joining our CIA after the war was Klaus Barbie, who visits the United States and Germany, Joseph Mengele, who visits California and New Orleans and New Jersey to see his family in New Jersey, Walter Rauff, working from Milan down in Chile with the torture and the Nazis down there, Joseph Mengele working with our energy department with NASA, and down in Paraguay, Karl Wolff, free to help set up NATO and the Nazis after the war. Now, as I say, Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Nixon and Haig helped put Walter Rauff's power in Chile up with Mr. Pinochet, because he became very important in training them in how to torture, to keep the people quiet and so forth. Now, the money that went into these death squads came out of Nugan Bank. That was the assassination teams brought over from dope dealing and dope traffic, and it brings in then Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley and Frank Churchill and Thomas Kleins, and they were into the Vietnam War that escalated thanks to the murder of John Kennedy. Then Lyndon Johnson and Fritz Kramer and Haig and Kissinger escalated the war, and the war brought in the dope traffic and the assassination death squads and the top military admirals and generals in Australia, dealing death in 26 countries with spokes coming out of a wheel out of the Nugan Bank, linked down to Colonial Dignidad, where the Nazis continue their torture and dissecting people and socializing. Colonial Dignidad is a colony between Chile and Argentina. We have these people together at the time of the Battle of the Bulge. My favorite people, these were Mr. Himmler's soldiers, the Death's Head unit of Mr. Wilhelm Mohnke, Mohnke, Fritz Kramer, and Piper and Dietrich, Skorzeny and Bormann, stalling the war, getting the Bormann money out. And later next week, I'll tell you how Mr. Gerd Heidemann goes to Mrs. Bormann. She moves from Germany to Italy and can continue with her husband's papers and blackmail the Western world and set up the Odessa as Mrs. Skorzeny does. She's still alive, these widows. Mrs. Hermann Goering operates and gives the yacht. Her daughter was a friend of Gerd Heidemann, and then it's a meeting place of the top Nazis. Incidentally, Melvin Belli was or is an attorney for Mrs. Hermann Goering. He represented Nazi Gestapo Errol Flynn and Jack Ruby. And now Lech Walesa, his wife, is trying to bring Lech Walesa to San Francisco for the Democratic Convention. That's another a combine of people all under the law offices of one person. Now, in Bern, Switzerland, Mr. Himmler was working with Allen Dulles and Mr. Wolf and Walter Rauff and Mr. Montini, the Secretary of the Vatican, and Martin Bormann, and various Jesuit priests. In fact, John Foster Dulles' son became a Jesuit priest with Martin Bormann's son, and they went down to South America together. And Mrs. Gerd Heidemann is praising the true story of Hitler. Now, the wife of the man who had so-called the diaries or produced them, she says it's a shame that they've stopped printing them, that there's more to tell, and she has some very revealing words that I'll share with you next week. But she thinks it's a tragedy that the young people who want to know so much about her Fuhrer are being kept deprived by stopping the diaries. As I say, only 2 diaries were seen, and there were 60 in total. I just die with curiosity to know what's in the other 58. Can you imagine? I don't believe it's all gossip about Himmler or Goring or Goebbels. Can you imagine? They say it was all taken from published material that was put out several years ago. But if that's true, why is everybody so nervous? Well, the FBI has gotten in the case. The European governments have called the FBI in the case. Well, the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was vice president of Interpol with all these top Nazis. And if any of you don't remember that, I can do details of J. Edgar Hoover working with them. Before and after the war, he adored them. He had their pictures on the wall, and then he took them down after Pearl Harbor, but became vice president of Interpol, and I can do more on Interpol with you. So when Reinhard Gehlen worked with Allen Dulles and came to the United States and set up the National Security Council and the CIA, and then went back to Germany before he set up his own intelligence agency, he was given hundreds of millions of dollars by the CIA, and he and Mr. Joseph Mengele and Klaus Barbie and Martin Bormann and Otto von Bolschwing and Otto Skorzeny and S.S. Wolf and Walter Rauff were all together. Now, the significance of these diaries so far, and it came to me immediately when the story broke, was, as I said before, the cast of characters that I mentioned last week. Who are the people? Forget, as I say, the ink, the paper, the amount paid. It doesn't matter whether they paid him 50 cents or 50 million. It wasn't done for money. They can rob a bank. They can take jewelry out of a store. They can counterfeit money. They can parlay money from narcotics all over the world. It wasn't for $3 million, whatever that Stern paid. That wasn't the important thing. Stern paid whatever it was, but Mr. Heidemann worked for them for 30 years. And the London Times has Lord Double-Dacker working for them. He's on the board of the London Times. So no newspaper likes to make a fool of themselves, and nobody sends a man to Europe to say, yes, it's authentic, we'll get it out. There's more problems that surface after the story begins to unfold than just saying, no, it's not authentic. So you get to the question of what is the purpose of this and why is Mr. Heidemann servicing now? Who is the SS person, the Wehrmacht person in Switzerland? Somebody has been sitting and writing these things, these 60 volumes or 50,000 pages. They may have started in 1964. That's the year that John Kennedy was killed, in November of 63. And they say these started being written in 64. If Treason for My Daily Bread is true, if Martin Bormann were part of the murder of John Kennedy, working with Clay Shaw through the Gehlen operation at the Trade Mart in New Orleans, which is what this book alleges, do they want their money paid now? Are they blackmailing the United States? Certainly, Mr. Rudolf Hess can't blackmail the United States because he can't even see family except one person a month alternating with 4 people and guards in the room and no notes. But all these other dogs are out loose, and they know what the British government has done. They know what the United States government has done. The only people who doesn't know it are the suckers, the citizens, who buy these books or read the articles of the cover story. So somebody is holding trump cards, and we'll do more on it next week because I knew it was a big story because of the people involved, the Death's Head, Himmler, Bormann. The Bormann are treasures, but the time is up now, so we got to go. I'll be back with you to continue on the Hitler Diaries and more news next week. This is Mae Brussel, and it's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.